See how this works. We'll try it out. So this week we'll be covering everything that's needed for your exam, which is on Tuesday. So your exam will be the same exact setup. So this is mostly multiple choice, your choice of short answer questions, and then 2 multi-part case studies. So with that said, let's get into the peripheral nervous system. We covered everything in the central nervous system, and now we're going to get into all of the nerves and all of the things everywhere else in the body. So first, let's understand that this is linking all of the sensory information to the central nervous system, right? So this is providing that incoming, that afferent information, and it's also carrying out and actually responding to the efferent information, the motor commands. That's what's going on in our peripheral nervous system, right? So we have our sensory receptors, sensory fibers from the periphery coming into our central nervous system, and then all of those motor commands being carried away and out. So we can actually break down our peripheral nervous system into functional units. So we have the sensory division, and we did a graphic organizer similar to this when we started with the nervous system, but we're going to get into more detail. So we have our sensory division. So our sensory division, this is all of our afferent fibers, right? And so by afferent, what we're talking about is arriving fibers that are bringing information from the periphery to the central nervous system. Now that we understand how the central nervous system is set up, we understand how that occurs on the dorsal side or posterior side of our spinal cord, and how that moves up those white tracts or fasciculi up to the brain, and how all of that sensory information is transmitted to the thalamus and then goes to where it needs to go from there. It can be broken down into 2 subunits though. We have the somatic sensory division, and we have our autonomic division. So the somatic division, when you hear the word somatic, you should automatically think of something that's voluntary, something that you're consciously aware of, right? You hear my voice, that's somatic. You feel your pen in your hand, right? That's somatic. So somatic are things that you're consciously aware of. These are things that are brought to your awareness. These are things that are actually processed on that somatosensory cortex. Right? So all of this is all relayed through the thalamus, right? Except for olfaction. Your autonomic nervous system, this is sometimes also just called your visceral sensory division, right? So autonomic or visceral, same difference. This is the stuff that you're not aware of, unaware, right? So this is your internal organs, your blood pressure, the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood, right? All of those little things, the amount of blood glucose that you have, your hormone levels, all of those things are being monitored, but you're not consciously aware of them. Our motor division is the other piece. So whereas our sensory division is the afferent, our motor division is the efferent, right? Let's hope these pens work. Oh yeah, there we go. Right, so efferent. These fibers exit the spinal cord on the anterior side. Remember that, all the motor information's on the front. And just like our sensory, we can break it down into somatic and visceral. Somatic motor and visceral motor. Or sometimes it's just called the autonomic, right? Autonomic and visceral are pretty much interchangeable. So our somatic motor, this is our skeletal muscles. When we talked about the neuromuscular junction, we were talking about the somatic motor system, right? We were talking about those motor neurons that travel down and release acetylcholine and all of that stuff, right? That's somatic motor. Right. Our visceral motor division, or our autonomic nervous system, right? This division works a little differently. This is all of our involuntary movements, right? So this is all of our cardiac and smooth muscle. right? Whereas this was all of our skeletal muscle. And so that autonomic nervous system, that autonomic division, can actually be broken down even more. We can break it down further. And we break it down into something called your sympathetic and your parasympathetic divisions. Now, you've probably heard of those terms before if you've ever taken any type of psychology class, right? The sympathetic division is the fight or flight division. This is that nervous, watching a scary movie. Did anyone watch The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix? I watched it. I'm like,
there's a mortician.
I'm obsessed with it now. I like can't stop reading about it. I want to learn more about it. I'm like so nerding over this. Okay, so anyways, the sympathetic nervous system was real while I was watching that. I was nervous, I was breathing deep. Sympathetic is fight or flight. This is that increased heart rate, increased respiration, sweaty palms, right? You might feel that walking into this class on some days. You'll definitely feel it probably on Tuesday, right? Test day. So this is fight or flight. And we have an entire chapter in the next unit dedicated to the autonomic nervous system. So this is just a taste of it. Right? And then we like to call the parasympathetic the opposite. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. This is kind of chill. This is, you know, when you overeat and you just want to go take a nap. That's your parasympathetic nervous system taking over. So we call it rest and digest. Right, so this is everything kind of slows down, your digestive system kicks in, right? All of those things happen, but it's the opposite of your sympathetic nervous system. So we'll look at how those two, that division, the autonomic division, works in chapter 14. So this breaks it all down for you. Good visual. Central nervous system, we have our sensory on one side, somatic and visceral. Motor on the other side, efferent division, right? Somatic, skeletal muscles, autonomic, going to all of the other things, glands, our heart, right? All of the smooth muscle, etc. Notice the direction of the arrows, right? All of the afferent information over here is blue, arriving. All of the efferent information, whoops, on the other side is red, efferent, exiting. All right, so let's talk about those nerves, right? Because nerves are how these impulses are going to travel. That's how the impulse of touch or pressure or pain gets to your brain. It's traveling through nerves. And so these peripheral nerves, right, nerves that are in the periphery, all of the nerves that are in your arms and legs, right, are mostly mixed nerves. In other words, they're carrying somatic, or they're carrying sensory and motor information. It's a two-lane highway, right? It's carrying information out from the central nervous system and up to the central nervous system. Most of them are mixed. Some of them are only one or the other, but most are mixed, right? They innervate almost all of our body structures, have peripheral nerves in them. Sensory nerves only contain sensory fibers, motor nerves only contain motor fibers, but mixed carries both. It's a two-lane highway. So let's talk about these spinal nerves, okay? So spinal nerves / peripheral nerves. The difference. Spinal nerves are the ones that come right off of your spinal cord, okay? So if we're talking about like the chain of events, right, we'll just talk about like efferent information, just to give an example. An efferent pathway, right? So the efferent pathway is going to travel, right? It all starts from your primary motor cortex. Oh, this pen is not going to make it. Primary motor cortex. Right, and from the primary motor cortex, it's going to go to the medullary pyramids, or the pyramids within the medulla oblongata. And that's where that crossing over occurs. Right? It's going to travel down the anterior column pathway. And depending on which motor commands they are, like which part of the body, but in general, the motor commands are going down the front of the spinal cord, right? Anterior column pathway of the spinal cord. And then from there, it will leave out the ventral root of the spinal cord, right? This is the spinal nerve. the ventral root continues to branch and branch and branch. It's as if your spinal cord is the tree trunk, or the big trunk of the tree, and the first big branch is the ventral root, right? And then from there, it's going to branch and branch and branch and branch and slowly get to the leaf, right? So that's what we're doing here. We have this big, thick ventral root that's going to continue to branch and branch and branch and branch until eventually you get to the body part, the muscle, right, that's going to be controlled. So that's our spinal nerve. This spinal nerve branches and forms peripheral nerves. And the peripheral nerves innervate the effectors, right? The effectors in this case would be skeletal muscle, because we're talking here about something coming from the primary motor cortex, right? So skeletal muscle is going to be the effector, or kind of the end point of this impulse. So our peripheral nerves could be sensory, they can be motor, they can be mixed. We just drew a motor pathway, so this would be a motor fiber or a mixed fiber, right? But when we're talking about a spinal nerve, what we're talking about is the actual thing that's leaving the spinal cord. And so our spinal cord has an anterior roots and posterior roots, or dorsal roots. And so if you remember, I'm going to have to erase my little thing here just because we have limited board space. But if you remember what the spinal cord looks like in a cross section, and you should be, just like we were practicing drawing like the neuromuscular junction, and we were practicing drawing things, you should be able to, when I say, we're going to quick, sketch out the spinal cord, you should have an idea of what that looks like, right? The spinal cord looking like this outer 8 on a side, right? And then this inner gray area, right? And then always have an idea as to exactly where the front and the back are. I tend to always draw it so that the front is up. It just makes sense to me, but if you get in the habit of always drawing the front down, that's fine. So this is anterior, and this is posterior. It's really important that you label anterior and posterior when you're drawing a cross section of the spinal cord, because otherwise it totally changes the meaning of everything, right? And so what we have coming off of the spinal cord, this is the same exact thing we drew last class, we're just adding on to it. We have that anterior root and a dorsal root, or posterior root, right? Off of that dorsal root is that ganglion, that dorsal root ganglion, and these things fuse together to form the spinal nerve. I didn't mean to make this a bump here, it's just me being a horrible artist. Right, it's gonna look something like that. Right, so you have an anterior root, a dorsal root, and a spinal nerve. Right, so the spinal nerve is gonna be a mixed nerve. And I'm going to write the word mixed in there so that you know that it's carrying both afferent and efferent pathways, right? Sensory and motor, right? All of our motor stuff comes off of the front. Why? Because I'm always moving forward in life, okay? All of the sensory stuff is on the posterior or dorsal side. Why? Because back rubs feel good, right? That's how I remember that, and I keep that in line in my brain. So the dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion, right there, that's a collection of cell bodies, right? A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. So now we're off of the spinal cord, we're in the periphery. Boom, that's where it is. I tend to call it the dorsal root ganglion instead of the posterior root ganglion. It doesn't matter. You already know that posterior and dorsal mean the same thing. So, tomato, tomato. But those fuse to form the spinal nerve, right? So our spinal nerve is that mixed nerve where they come together. So out here is a 2-lane highway. This is one way out, this is one way in, this is 2 ways. If I had more room and thinner markers, I would probably even draw some arrows in there showing that this is all outgoing information, this is all incoming information, and this is a 2-lane highway, right, where they're going in opposite directions. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves, right? So this is what we just drew, right? But what's interesting is out here, the structure of this nerve, right? So this nerve, this is like the first branch of a tree, right? That first big limb. and then it keeps branching smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's what this guy is going to do, right? Some of those axons in there are going to branch off and go down to your pinky finger, and some of them will branch and go down to your ring finger, and some of them branch and go down to your middle finger, and so on and so forth, right? Some of them branch off and just go to the cutaneous receptors in your skin, right? They branch and they all go to different levels, but it's just one thing coming off of your spinal cord, right? Because there's only 31 total coming off. So that structure, this structure, is surrounded by connective tissue, just like we've seen in every single system along the way. What are our bones surrounded by? A periosteum. Our cartilage is surrounded by a perichondrium. Our muscles are surrounded by that epimysium, right? They're all surrounded by different types of connective tissue. Why would our nervous system be any different? Boom, here's our nerves surrounded by connective tissue. We have the epineuron, which surrounds the whole outside of the nerve. So this whole outside is surrounded by an epineuron. Spinal nerve surrounded by an epineuron. And guess what? The individual axons inside the nerve are bundled in fascicles, just like our skeletal muscles. They're already bundled, right? And so they're surrounded by a perineuron. It's the same exact structure, right? Individual axons are surrounded by an endoneuron. That's what you see in lab. When you look at the neuron model in lab, on the distal end of the axon, you'll see this little gray, like spider web. That's the endoneuron. It's the connective tissue that surrounds each individual axon. Bless you. There we go. I'm not going to draw it because I got this guy up here. But it's the same, and it's the same, literally the same exact concept. We could just color all of this red and say, yep, there you go, it's a muscle, right? Right. Epineuron, bundles of fascicles surrounded by a perineuron, and then each individual axon surrounded by its own endoneuron. The myelin is underneath of the endoneuron, so the myelin is still there, right? The myelinated axons, those oligodendrocytes or Schwann cells, they're still there. Notice, oops, let me go back just a second. Notice that there's blood vessels in there, right? So blood vessels run with the nerves, right? Because your neurons need oxygen, right? They're going to metabolize, they're going to produce carbon dioxide, so they have to have a way of getting nutrients and getting rid of waste products. Okay. There we go. Cranial nerves. So those were spinal nerves. Spinal nerves come off of the spinal cord, 31 pairs. We have cranial nerves, though, that come off of our brain. So literally nerves that dangle off of our brain. We tend to think of just the spinal cord coming off of the brain, but there are 12 pairs of nerves that come off of our brain also. So if I were to have a brain dangling here in front of you, you'd have this one big spinal cord and 12 pairs of little dangly stringy things, the cranial nerves, right? And so these cranial nerves are sensory and motor or mixed, just like the spinal, right? So some of them are purely sensory, some of them are purely motor, most of them are mixed, hearing both, right? And so we're going to go through and talk about the specific cranial nerves and what they do eventually, but we're just kind of walking through the different types of nerves right now, right? So we have the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. So let's go over, in general, the peripheral nervous system. What is it doing? We made that graphic organizer. We broke it down: somatic, sensory, visceral, sensory, somatic motor, visceral motor. But in general, we're talking about this pathway, this sequence. So I'm actually going to keep this up here, but I'm going to add another half to it, okay? Because this is really the big idea. I'll bring both. I don't know how many I'm going to need. All right. So we all start with some type of stimulus. Every pathway is going to start with some type of stimulus. Let's say a touch, a pinprick, a pain sensation, a temperature sensation, a sound, right? Any type of sensation, you have a stimulus. And if you have a stimulus, in order for it to be detected, you have to have a receptor for that stimulus. So you need something there to even say, aha, I know what you are. You're a touch, you're a light touch, you're a deep touch, you're a deep pressure, you're a temperature. This is pain, right? This is heat, right? So you have to have the receptor for the thing that's being given to you. So the stimulus is going to activate the receptor, all right? And so in order for any of this information to get up to our brain, so our primary motor cortex can even respond, we have to get that information, bundle it up, send that action potential, right? Transduce all of that information, and along the way, every single synapse has to say, yep, this is important. Yep, I'm going to depolarize and continue to send this signal. In other words, all of the action potentials are excitatory postsynaptic potentials, right? They have to jump across the synapse and cause a depolarization on the postsynaptic cell. So the impulses have to travel up to the spinal cord. So from our receptor, we're going to travel up a sensory neuron, right? Which again, this is a peripheral nerve. And because here we're talking about some type of stimulus and receptor, let's say that this is temperature, for example, a temperature stimulus. This would be a somatic sensory neuron, right? If the stimulus was something like a food moving through your small intestine, right, then it would be a visceral sensory neuron, right? But I'm choosing to do something somatic because we chose to do skeletal muscle here. We're somatic here, so I'm just trying to keep it parallel. So we're going to start with a somatic sense, something that we're consciously aware of. Temperature stimulus, heat, cold, whatever, traveling through a sensory neuron, right? So you can even say a somatic sensory neuron here. And so those neurons are going to synapse. Oops, let's talk about motor command, sorry. That information is going to synapse and travel up to the brain. I'm going to kind of jump a little bit ahead of what the PowerPoint's saying, just so that I can make this point to you. So that sensory neuron is going to get to our dorsal root, go through the dorsal root ganglion. It's going to synapse at the dorsal root ganglion, right? And it's going to travel up to the thalamus, because that's where all the sensory information goes, right? And the thalamus is going to say, huh, I should probably be aware of this heat, cold, temperature thing, right? And then that information is going to travel to the primary sensory cortex. And then there's one other thing that has to take place. We have our primary sensory cortex neuron saying, oh yeah, that's a pretty hot thing that we just touched, right? Or pretty cold thing, whatever the temperature stimulus is. There's one more neuron that we have to go through. It begins with an I. It's called an interneuron. The interneuron is the link between the sensory cortex and the motor cortex. So it's linking them. It's saying, hey buddy, okay, wake up, we need to do something about this. Right? And then our entire efferent pathway can take place. Right? And so that impulse is going to be sent out the motor division on a specific spinal nerve, right? The spinal nerve, more than likely, the same spinal nerve that the incoming information was sent down, right? So if it was, spinal nerve 12 or whatever, right? Then it's going to be motor nerve 12. It's going to travel out the same pathway because you're going to want to respond in that same locality, triggering a contraction. So, and we're going to look, our main goal in this chapter is to understand this pathway and how it works. Let's talk about some of our cranial nerves. Let's get into some of them. So I will tell you, you have to know all 12 pairs of cranial nerves. You need to know the name, the number, And when I say number, I mean like the Roman numeral. So if you don't know Roman numerals, like X, VI, things like that, you gotta learn them, or at least have them memorized for these 12. You only have to remember 12 of them, right? The name, the number, the type of fibers. So this would be sensory, motor, or mixed. Right? It's going to be one or the other. Right? It's either going to be sensory, it's going to be motor, or it's going to be mixed for each of them. And then you have to know what it does, its function. And so we'll flip through them. And there's 800 million mnemonic devices out there to learn them. My personal opinion of mnemonic devices is they're a little bit of a waste of time because you have to remember all of the words of the mnemonic device, and then you have to remember what those letters stand for. But that's just, I think it's double work. So when I learned these, I just had to memorize them like this. And you guys don't have to do this, but back in my day, we actually had to dissect the cat in lab, and then we had to identify all the cranial nerves on the cat brain, like in front of the instructor. It was like, talk about pressure. Not only did you have to know where they were, but you had to like know it on the fly, and not all brains are the same, and so it was really tricky. But there are ways to do it, so it's not impossible. So first three that we'll learn, these are all sensory. So olfactory is cranial nerve number 1. That's our sense of smell. Right, so this is purely sensory. So this is all of your sensory information dealing with your sense of smell, traveling through cranial nerve number 1. Cranial nerve number 2 is optic. This is your optic nerve. Remember that optic canal on the skull? That's where your optic nerve goes. It literally leaves the back of your eye, goes through the optic canal, and back to your brain. It's carrying all of your visual input. And then the vestibular cochlear nerve. This is in your inner ear. So these are actually all linked to what we call our special senses. And so these are the things that we have special sense organs for, right? Our vestibular cochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. This is our balance and our sense of hearing. This is all coming from the inner ear. These are all purely sensory nerves, 1, 2, and 7. Whoops. All right, so there they are. And again, this is just showing you, so this tells you like where it originates and where it goes through, what hole it goes through, and all of those things. You don't have to know all that. I personally think it's kind of cool because we took all of that time to learn all of the foramina and all the holes, so it's kind of cool to be like, oh, that's what passes through the foramen rotundum, you know? But you don't have, I'm not gonna test you on that, right? I'm literally just testing on those 4 things right there. So these are purely motor. These are purely motor. So look at the first one, oculomotor. I mean, it literally gives you the name in it, right? Oculomotor. Ocular motor moves the eyes. Yeah, good. Trochlear, abducens. Those are also eye movers. Accessory and hypoglossal. Abducens, accessory, and hypoglossal. They all have to do with your larynx and your tongue. So because these are all coming off of your brain, they're all having to do with things that are on your head and neck. Right? You're not going to have a nerve coming off of your brain that goes down to your knee. Right? Everything that comes off of the brain is kind of localized. Right? And so this one, just going through some of them, this shows you where they go. Again, the ocular motor, trochlear, and abducens, those are all motor nerves for your eyeballs. They could literally control, you have all of these little eye muscles that control where your eyes move, and it's pretty complex. And so that's what those do. They're literally controlling each individual extrinsic eye muscle. And then we have the accessory and the hypoglossal, which are all linked to tongue movement and throat movement. So then we have mixed, our mixed nerves, our trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. So trigeminal is also an eye. It's sensory and motor of the eye. Facial is what you would think it does. This is motor commands. So this facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7, is controlling our facial muscles. Glossopharyngeal, this is again throat, our salivary glands. That prefix glosso, like hypoglossal, and glossopharyngeal is referring to your tongue. And then the vagus. The vagus nerve is one of the, they're all very, very important. But the vagus nerve is the longest cranial nerve. So this one actually leaves the brain, head and neck area, and this goes down into your thoracic and abdominal cavities. This is the one that's going to innervate your heart and your lungs and your diaphragm and your intestines and control all of that stuff. So it's sensory and motor. So this is just going through, again, trigeminal. This is some of the parts of the eye, facial, parts of the face. Oops. And so again, you don't have to know all of the different branches. So your textbook goes into the different branches of the nerves and the different branches of the vagus nerve and things like that. You don't have to worry about those. You just need to know the name, the number, the type, whether it's sensory, motor, or mixed, and the function, what it does. So see, vagus goes all over. So this is showing you where they are on the brain, right? So that's what I had to identify. It was just little stumpy cut off nerves. It's awful. But what I did, right, so this is the trick, you just kind of pick a spot and then you just memorize them in order, right? So I think I started up here, right, because that makes sense because it kind of sticks off. So you have your optic and your olfactory up here. And then I just kind of went around and just kind of memorized them like clockwise. So it's not impossible to do. It's just, why do that? I don't know. I don't think that's like a super important thing to know how to, in life. But anyways, let's talk about some like cases and things like that that relate to these cranial nerves. So something called trigeminal neuralgia. So trigeminal neuralgia, this is a chronic pain disorder. It's a chronic pain syndrome. It involves a couple of the branches of the trigeminal nerve, right? So patients are going to get lots of pain, kind of coming in spurts. Chewing, vibration, things like that can actually trigger this pain. And because this is the trigeminal nerve, this is this kind of area of the face, like around the eye and around the cheeks. That's where your trigeminal nerve innervates. So chewing and things like that can, even sometimes a light breeze can just trigger like a stabbing type of pain. Because nerve pain, and you guys know this from living, right? Nerve pain is different than like a muscular pain. Muscular pain is like an ache and like a dull pain. Nerve pain is like a sharp burning pain. And so that's what this feels like. It's like a sharp burning sensation in those areas, almost like you forgot to wash your hands after cutting jalapenos, right? That kind of burning sensation. So there's lots of neurological examinations that will look for the function of your cranial nerves. One of the first things that happens after you've been hit in the head is they check what's called your pupillary light reflex. Like they shine the light in your eyes. That's checking to make sure your cranial nerves are able to actually contract and dilate your iris. They'll move their finger back and forth to make sure all of those eye muscles are able to contract and move your eye in the correct pattern. Because if they can't, then it says, okay, well, their eye muscles aren't moving correctly. Their eye muscles are linked to a cranial nerve. The cranial nerve is on their brain, right? And so this could indicate brain damage, right? Of course, most clinicians that are doing that aren't thinking all of those things, but that's the reason they do them. That's the reason that's a thing. There we go. Nope. There we go. Bell's palsy is another one. So this one's pretty common. Bell's palsy is the facial nerve, right? Paralysis of facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7. And so that nerve, right, it's a mixed nerve. So this is the nerve that innervates all of your facial muscles. So when you get paralysis of this nerve, maybe because of a swelling in the brain or some type of spasm, the whole side of your face tends to droop, right? And then you don't have the ability to actually move that side of the face. So this is common in viruses, tumors, and other traumas. Maybe just getting in a car accident can trigger Bell's palsy, and it can kind of come and go. Epileptics can see episodes of Bell's palsy come and go. or this could be signifying some type of larger damage. But it can be really harmful because if that side of your face is paralyzed, not only is it going to make it really difficult for you to chew and swallow with only half your mouth working, not to mention embarrassing when you go to like drink something and stuff comes out your mouth, right? But you have to be able to blink your eye. You have to be able to get that moisture on your eye, so it can really be tricky. Okay, treatment, usually because it's caused by some type of flare-up, an inflammation, taking anti-inflammatory can help. Physical therapy, it kind of depends. It's a case-by-case type thing. So this is, I told you guys I don't love mnemonic devices, but it's just showing you some of them or how you can create your own, right? So ways to remember the actual order of them, right? Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are happening, right? I mean, most of the ones I know are really perverted. They just make it easier to remember because they're funny. So that's possible. And then if you remember that you have one nose and two eyes, that way you don't get your O's mixed up. And then there's other ones that were kind of meant to remember their function, sensory, motor, or mixed, right? Some say money matters, but stands for both, right? The B stands for both. But my brother says big brains matter more, or big butts matter more. You can make your own thing, right? So anyways, naming them like that, and when you get, this is like a test strategy, right? When you get your test and your quiz, and I see a lot of you guys do this, you can kind of brain dump that type of thing on your paper, and then there's a reference for when it comes up, in a multiple choice or short answer question, right? So if this type of thing works for you, I tend to I memorize it just the way it is, but my brain works different, obviously. All right, so let's go back to talking about spinal nerves and how all of these things kind of work together and are put together. So our spinal nerve, this thing, right, kind of branches off. So it's really only like this for like a hot minute, and you'll see this on the spinal cord model in lab. It's just a short segment that it actually looks like this, because then it starts branching some more. And it branches into what's called a posterior ramus and an anterior ramus. So a posterior ramus, if you remember the term ramus from bones, ramus is like an arm or a projection. So we have a posterior ramus coming off the back. Right? This is going to carry information to the back wall of the body, your back muscles, right? All of your sensory information on the back, all of your motor information on the back. This would be your posterior or dorsal ramus. So it's important not to get the word ramus and root mixed up, right? The dorsal root is the actual thing that's branching off of the spinal cord. The ramus is just a little nubbin popping off of the spinal nerve. And then you have a ventral or an anterior ramus. I usually call it the ventral ramus, it doesn't matter. But that's going to be the continuation of that spinal nerve. So this is bringing information to the sides of the body and to the front wall of the body. Right, so this is just showing you it's really only a spinal nerve for a hot second, and then it branches off posterior, anterior. That anterior ramus continues on to wherever it needs to go, on the thoracic or abdominal cavity, wherever. This extra piece that's coming off here, this is called the rami communicans, and we'll talk about that when we do the autonomic nervous system. It's part of that pathway. So for right now, we're really only concerned with this and this, so posterior ramus and your ventral ramus. Right, so your anterior root is carrying all of your motor information, right? Your dorsal root's carrying all of your sensory information. Your posterior ramus, right? Notice it's carrying mixed. It's mixed motor and sensory to the back wall of the body. Your anterior ramus is mixed. It's carrying motor and sensory information to the front wall of the body and to the sides of the body, which is why it's bigger, right? Because our sides and our front take up more space than just our back. Right? So as we said, you have those 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So our spinal nerves are broken down into kind of groups and classifications based on the vertebrae. 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 1 coccygeal. That should look a little familiar, right? Those numbers, right? Because they're literally corresponding to the vertebrae that they branch from. Remember, these spinal nerves are coming through that intervertebral foramen, right? They're coming through that little hole. When they're stacked together, that's where they're branching off of. The anterior rami, right? So this anterior ramus of all of our spinal nerves are actually further classified and grouped together in something called a plexus. So a plexus is a group of spinal nerves that kind of all go to the same general area. So there's a cervical plexus. Guess what? That's the plexus of your neck. You have a brachial plexus. That's all the nerves that go down your arms. You have a lumbar plexus. Those are all of the nerves that innervate your lumbar region. And then you have a sacral plexus, which are all the nerves that go down your legs. Right? So the nerves can be grouped based upon where they go. And that group is just called a plexus. So hiccups are actually caused by a spasm of the nerves that innervate the diaphragm. There's a nerve that's part of your, one of your plexuses. It's called the phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve goes down and innervates your diaphragm. And your diaphragm is what contracts and depresses to increase the volume and decrease the pressure and allow for inhalation to take place. And so one way to do it, well, what are some of the ways? I actually talked about this in my other lecture today. What are some of the ways that you've heard to actually cure the hiccups? Hold your breath. Or do what?
Scared.
Yeah, kind of get scared. Maybe take a drink of water. That was another one. So all of those things all have the same thing in common. It's all kind of regaining control of that muscle, right? When you hold your breath, you're keeping that diaphragm down there. You're not letting anything kind of depress it or raise it to make the hiccup happen. Same thing with drinking, right? Because when you're drinking, you're not breathing. And same thing when you get scared. When you get scared, right? You kind of, that brief inhalation kind of resets everything. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But because of your phrenic nerve breaking off of that cervical plexus, what you can do is you can actually press into your cervical vertebrae right in your neck region, right? So your cervical vertebrae kind of go down and they go a little past like your trapezius muscles. So they kind of go right into this area. But you want to touch it just right below your head. And what you'll find is putting pressure there kind of distorts the phrenic nerve a little bit, and the phrenic nerve will kind of freak out because it's being pressed upon. That's not a really normal area to get pressure on, and so that kind of resets your phrenic nerve and stops that impulse. Try it the next time you have it. Let me know if it really works. I'm not one to get hiccups a lot, but I know a lot of people are really hiccup prone, so let me know. All right, so we're going to talk about these receptors. We're going to talk about how this happens. Okay, types of receptors in the body, because it's really important that we understand how these work. Now, we've talked about different types of receptors on cells, cellular receptors, right? We've talked about voltage-gated channels and mechanically gated channels and all of those, right? So those all have a receptor on them or near them that's going to kind of open in response to whatever the stimulus is. So here we're looking at the same general idea. All of our receptors have a certain stimulus that they're going to respond to. So our sensory receptors all undergo this same basic pathway, right? They have ion channels on the axolemma, right, on their axon. They're all closed, right? Stimulus is detected. That stimulus is going to cause the sodium channels to open, right? Depolarization, sodium rushes in, and that whole cascade of events happens, right? This is how action potentials are sent. This is how sensory information gets sent. This is what happens between here and here, right? Between the receptor and the sensory neuron and all the way up to the central nervous system. That whole pathway has to happen. If enough sodium ions enter, a depolarization happens, the action potential is sent, and the signal can continue to go on, right? This is neurophys revisited, right? So it's coming back to haunt us. So mechanically gated channels are going to be one of our main players here in our somatic nervous system, right? Or yeah, in our somatic sensory nervous system, because that's really what we're consciously aware of, things that are touching us. And so that's going to be detected by literally pressure. The pressure or the distortion of those receptor cells allows for those sodium channels to open, that allows for the depolarization. We're used to something like binding, right? Like acetylcholine has to bind, or a neurotransmitter has to bind in order for those channels to open. Well, in this case, there's nothing binding, right? In this case, it's literally a distortion. And so we'll look at how that happens. That pressure causes that depolarization. Our sensory receptors can be what we call fast adapting or slow adapting. So adaptation is something that all of our sensory receptors do. You probably aren't thinking right now of the sensations of your shirt on your back, right? Until I bring it to your awareness. But the sensory receptors on your back have adjusted to the fact that you have a constant touch, right? This constant light touch of your shirt on you all the time. They're rapidly adapting, right? Your socks and your shoes, right, on your feet. You're not thinking about that. It's there. Those receptors are still feeling that. Those receptors are still distorting. They're still sending action potential. But they've now adapted to the fact that that's going to happen, right? It's called fast adapting. Slow adapting are things that it really takes you a long time to get used to. This is sometimes a lot of pain receptors. It takes you a lot of time to kind of adjust to that level. And so the constant action potentials will slowly diminish over time, but it takes a lot longer for those slow adapting. So think about, I always think of the sense of smell, right? We're all kind of used to the smell of our house, right? Like you probably don't even know the smell of your own house, but if I came to your house, I'd be like, oh, you know, it smells like cats, or oh, it smells like, you know, cologne or perfume or whatever, right? But when you come to my house, I don't smell anything, but you come in and you might be like, dang, it stinks in here. I hope you don't, but you know, my house probably smells like paint because we're painting right now. But anyways, that type of a thing. Your sense of smell adapts quickly over time. You're used to it. I'm not. A new person comes in and has to take time to adapt. And we'll look at how your different senses like vision and sense of smell and hearing, all of that adapt when we do our special senses. It's kind of a survival mechanism. All of the things that could potentially be dangerous to you don't adapt quickly, right? All of the things that probably won't kill you are fast adapting. So the sensory receptors, for the most part, can either be encapsulated in a special organ, or they can be free nerve endings. So we've talked about some encapsulated nerve endings before. The lemmated corpuscles, for example, right? The Meissner's corpuscles, the Merkel's disc. We've seen and heard of all of those things before when we did the integumentary system. But free nerve endings don't have those same kind of supportive cells as part of their structure. So we also have a classification of sensory receptors where they can either be exteroreceptors, where they're kind of monitoring things on the outside of our body, or interoreceptors, things on the inside of our body. And so exteroreceptors tend to be those somatic types of receptors, the things that we're consciously aware of. We're consciously aware of the touch and the temperature and things like that. The interoreceptors tend to be those visceral receptors that we're not aware of. Now there's exceptions to those rules, which is why I didn't really classify them up here yet, but that is a further classification of some of our sensory receptors. But let's look at the general types. So we have mechanoreceptors, right? Mechanoreceptors are special receptors that respond to distortion. Right? So these are going to actually distort in shape. So they have mechanically gated channels. Right? That when they're distorted, those sodium channels get distorted, they open and allow sodium to rush in and allow the cell to depolarize, etc. Right? And so this would be things like touch, pressure, vibration, stretch, anything that would change what a membrane normally looks like would be that. And we have thermoreceptors, which are detecting temperature. So again, these could be intero or exteroreceptors, so they could be both. Most are slow adapting, right? So it takes them a while for you to realize that you're not cold anymore, right? It takes you a while to realize that you're not hot anymore, right? They're really depolarizing against temperature changes. So an example, it's not quite, I mean, it's chilly out, but it's not really, really cold out yet. But imagine that it's a blustery day out there and the wind is whipping around and you go out there and you're freezing, but you run into a friend and they want to talk to you and you're freaking cold, right? You're going to stop and talk to them. And when you first get out there, you're so cold, you see them, you're like, oh man, they're going to want to talk to me. Okay, you're cold, you're cold, you're cold. But by the time they get done telling you this awesome story about how you're the coolest person on the planet, you're not cold anymore. You're not feeling that coldness anymore. You're cold to touch. Your body has adapted. It takes some time for your thermoreceptors to adapt. They're slow adapting. And at that point, they'll only reactivate again if there's a change. When the wind gusts a little bit more, right? Or when you walk around the building and then all of a sudden there's lots of wind hitting you, right? Then you'll notice and remember, oh yeah, it's pretty freaking cold out here. I need to get in my car, right? So it's only then where a change will actually reactivate those receptors. Otherwise, they've probably already adapted. Chemoreceptors can be intero and exteroreceptors also, so they can detect changes in chemicals. Right, so these can be intero and extero, and these are going to open or respond when there's specific chemicals. These are chemically gated ion channels that are going to work here. Right, intero, I'm going to write intero and extero. And I'll add that over here too, because these can be intero and extero. And so they're going to detect different chemicals, different neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine, for example, will be a chemoreceptor. Or we can talk about maybe receptors that are detecting levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Chemoreceptors will detect your blood pH, right? They'll detect the hydrogen ion levels in your blood. Chemoreceptors are detecting your blood glucose levels, right? They're literally detecting chemicals dissolved in the solution. We also have photoreceptors. Photoreceptors are found only in our eye, right? That's where we detect light. So we'll talk about those when we do our special senses. And then we also have nociceptors. Nociceptors are for pain. These are usually slow adapting as well. So it takes you a while to adjust to the fact that something just hurt you or something hurts. Again, survival mechanism, right? If something's hurting you, your body needs to be able to respond to it. And so an example of this, so hot peppers actually have a chemical in them called capsaicin. And so when you eat like a jalapeno or like something, jalapenos really aren't that spicy in reality, but when you eat something really, really spicy, right? And you feel that almost burning fire sensation on your tongue. Now for some people, jalapenos do that to them, right? Everyone has a varying level of this kind of spicy sensitivity. As my husband literally like washes off his chicken wings and his crabs, and try not to make fun of him, but he's a cool guy, so it's all right. Because he's just super sensitive to it. Anyways, capsaicin is going to open ligand-gated or chemically gated ion channels and cause a depolarization in your nociceptors. But guess what? When it stays around for a long period of time, it actually desensitizes those nociceptors, right? So this is why once you start eating the spicy wings, you're like, dang, whew, these are spicy, right? But by like your 10th wing, you don't even notice it anymore. Right, you've adapted to it. The capsaicin has actually desensitized, and it's just that chemical, capsaicin itself, desensitizes the nociceptors. So at first it activates the nociceptors, and then it desensitizes after hanging around for longer. Right, and so this is something that's only in these like peppers. Well, pharmacologists have kind of harnessed the power of capsaicin and have put it in different medical creams and such. So capsaicin is actually a medical thing, right? A cream or a prescription that you can get to topically apply or whatever when you have various pain disorders, like shingles would be an example of this, like nerve pain. So capsaicin gets applied, it burns at first, but then it tends to numb and desensitize those pain receptors, so you don't feel the pain anymore. So it simply kind of turns them off, allows them to stop sending that depolarization, so you're not going to feel it. Makes them less able to relay that information, kind of blocks them from sending it. It's kind of cool. Let's talk about different types of mechanoreceptors. So we have Merkel cells or Merkel fibers, right? So these are all going to, I'm going to do this off of this. So we've talked about Merkel cells before, right? Merkel cells are all in our integumentary system. This is for touch, right? This is that kind of what we call discriminative touch. This is like texture, form, right? So kind of fine touch, detailed touch. You can tell if something's rough or bumpy. You can tell if something has sharp edges, things like that. These are slow adapting, so it takes your body a while to adjust to these. Then you have the Meissner's corpuscles, which are also discriminative touch. So these are also a type of touch, but these are fast adapting. So that's the big difference here. So these are Merkel cells are slow adapting. Meissner's corpuscles are fast adapting. And they're for fine touch also. By fine touch, I mean like a detailed touch, right? Actually being able to feel like the ridges of something or details. Phrenic corpuscles, these are also slow adapting, and this is for stretch. I think of someone being rough, right? Someone being rough, maybe like twisting your arm, right? Pulling your arm. You know how like little kids, when they're like messing with each other, they'll come up and they'll do that like little twisting thing where they're like twisting your arm and stretching your skin. Hurts really bad, right? So that's your Phrenic corpuscles when kids are playing rough like that. And because it's slow adapting, it hurts, right? You feel it for a while. Lemmallated corpuscles, we've mentioned these before also. So lemmallated corpuscles, these are relatively fast adapting. This is for deep touch and deep pressure. Right, so this is when you, I don't know, I'm thinking like leaning over something, and I'm like, oh man, this corner of this table is like digging into my leg, right? It's fast adapting. So as I'm doing this, I feel it less and less, right? And our lab this week kind of explores some of these different sensory receptors, so you have the chance to kind of play around with them a little bit. We also have receptacles or free nerve endings on our hair. So they're called hair follicle receptors. And so these are very, these are going to respond when your hair is moved, right? When there's like a breeze across your hair. And then we also have another type of mechanoreceptor called a proprioreceptor. These are actually within your muscles and within your joints. These are in your musculoskeletal system. These are giving information about how you're moving and how your body's positioned. and tactile. Oh, we did that already. Going the wrong way. There we go. This is a picture to show you where. So again, most of these are all associated with our integumentary system. They're all embedded in our dermis and our hypodermis, maybe extending into the lower layers of our epidermis. There's free nerve endings in there, all giving information about our external environment, right? So most of these are external receptors. They're going to work on the outside of our body. Some of them can distort. So for example, stretching, right? Maybe like your stomach stretching as it fills with food, right? Things like that. That would be a Ruffini corpuscle doing that. There's different types of thermoreceptors. So we actually have hot receptors and cold receptors. So not all thermoreceptors are the same. In fact, they come in different numbers also. That's another tell you, but you actually have more cold receptors than hot receptors. You have cold receptors and hot receptors.
Are they gated?
Do what?
Are they gated?
Are they gated?
Yeah.
Are they? So no, these work differently.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So they're not going to. It's not going to be a like mechanically gated or chemically gated channel. It works differently. Yeah. So any temperature outside of these normal ranges, kind of 10. We'll talk Fahrenheit because we're in America, right? 50 to 118 degrees. Anything above that or below that, you're actually going to sense as pain. You'll feel as pain, which is why, that dry ice, right? They say like don't touch it, it'll burn you, it'll hurt you. Well, that's why, because it's below that temperature, right? And obviously anything boiling, boiling is 212 degrees, right? So that's even higher than that. So that would be detected as nociceptor. So temperature is it's a special type of receptor, and it's similar to a nociceptor, similar to a pain receptor. So actually, I want to stop here. That was a good timing. We finished just a little bit early, and we'll pick up on the next slide next class, and I'll have your quizzes graded and handed back to you, both sets, for tomorrow.